The commander's voice cut through the sealed briefing room like a blade. "I need someone cleared for black operations." Chairs creaked, breath caught. Before my mind could second-guess my body, I stood. A short, sharp laugh broke the silence, my father's. "Sit down," he said loud enough for others to hear. "You don't belong here." The commander turned toward me. "Call sign," I answered without raising my voice. "Shadow 9. The room changed. My father stopped breathing. In that moment, he realized he had never known his own daughter. I'll go back now because nothing about that moment made sense without the years that came before it. I grew up in a house where everything had its place and everyone had their role. My father believed in order the way other men believe in faith. Shoes lined by the door, flags folded just so, voices kept low. He'd served the Navy most of his adult life and carried it into retirement like a second spine. Even at home, he moved with a quiet authority that told the rest of us to make room. My brother fit easily into that world. He was loud where I was careful, confident where I hesitated. When he brought home trophies or talked about enlisting, my father's eyes lit in a way I never saw directed at me. I don't think my father meant to make comparisons, but he didn't stop them either. He called my brother a natural leader. I was thoughtful. He said my brother had the right instincts. I was detail-oriented. Praise I learned early had categories. When I told my father I was joining the Navy, he nodded but didn't ask questions. When my brother talked about his plans, my father stayed up late with him at the kitchen table sketching futures on scrap paper. With me, the conversation ended quickly. "Good benefits," my father said once. "You'll learn discipline." He assumed it was a phase, something I'd grow out of when real life arrived. I stopped correcting him after a while. It wasn't secrecy so much as exhaustion. Every explanation turned into a debate, every accomplishment into something smaller once it passed through his expectations. So I learned to answer carefully. I learned to let silence do the work. Years went by. Deployments came and went. I missed birthdays, then holidays. I sent postcards instead of stories. When I came home, my father asked general questions. "You staying busy? They treating you right?" I said yes and yes again, because the truth didn't fit into his understanding of me, and I didn't have the energy to force it. The invitation that set everything in motion came in a plain envelope with a return address I recognized instantly. A secure facility, a formal briefing tied to a recognition ceremony. My brother's name appeared once in bold. Mine appeared near the bottom, listed as family. No rank, no role, just a seat. I considered not going. I'd learned the value of choosing my battles. But something in me, a quiet, stubborn part, said this wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about showing up. About standing where I belonged, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The morning of the briefing, the base looked like every base I'd ever known. Concrete buildings, trimmed lawns, flags snapping in the breeze. The smell of coffee and metal. Security was tight. Phones surrendered. Badges checked twice. My father walked ahead of me, greeting old colleagues, shoulders squared, comfortable in a space that reflected his identity back at him. He introduced me as his daughter, nothing more. I didn't correct him. Inside the briefing room, I took a seat along the wall. The room filled slowly, conversations low and clipped. When the doors sealed and the lights dimmed slightly, the mood shifted. This wasn't ceremonial. This was operational. The kind of room where words mattered. The commander stepped forward, his presence steady, his voice calm. He spoke about the situation plainly without flourish. Then he said the line that changed everything. "I need someone cleared for black operations." It wasn't a challenge, it was a necessity. I stood because that was my job. My father's laugh startled me more than the commander's words. It was instinctive, almost protective, as if he thought I'd misunderstood. "Sit down," he said. "You don't belong here." There was no malice in it, just certainty. The commander looked at me, really looked. "Call sign," he asked. I said it, just once, Shadow 9. Recognition moved through the room like a current. No applause, no gasps, just understanding. The commander nodded and continued as if this were the most natural thing in the world. My father didn't move. His face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open, as if his body hadn't caught up with what his mind was trying to process. For the first time I could remember, he had no words ready. I stayed standing, listening, taking notes, doing what I'd always done. Inside, I felt no triumph, only a strange, heavy calm. The moment wasn't about proving him wrong, it was about truth finally occupying the same space as assumption. Later, when the room emptied and the noise returned in fragments, my father lingered behind. He didn't look at me right away. When he did, his eyes were different, searching, unsteady. We didn't speak then. Some conversations need time to ripen. What he realized in that room wasn't just that I was capable, it was that his certainty about me had been wrong. And for a man who built his life on knowing where things stood, that realization landed hard. I walked out into the daylight alone, the air sharp and clean. I'd carried this part of myself quietly for years. Now it was out in the open, unchanged, steady as it had always been. And for the first time I wondered what would come next for both of us. I didn't sleep much the night after the briefing. Not because of what had happened in the room, but because of what hadn't happened afterward. There had been no confrontation, no apology, no awkward attempt at explanation. My father and I had walked out of the building separately like strangers who happened to share a last name. That silence followed me home and sat beside me at the kitchen table as I drank my coffee the next morning. The next invitation came sooner than I expected. It was from my father, a short message typed, not handwritten. He was never one for extra words. There was another event scheduled on base, a smaller gathering tied to follow-up briefings, and a recognition luncheon for a mixed group of officers and civilian leadership. My brother would be there again. "You should come," my father wrote. No explanation, no tone markers, just an opening. I read the message twice before replying. "I'll be there," I wrote back. Nothing more. The drive onto the base that morning felt familiar in a way that settled me. The guard at the gate checked my identification, scanned it, then glanced up at me with a look that lingered half a second longer than usual. He handed it back with a nod that carried a subtle weight of respect. I'd grown used to those moments over the years, the quiet acknowledgments that came without conversation. They weren't personal, they were professional, and I preferred it that way. The parking lot was already filling when I arrived. I spotted my father near the entrance, standing with two men I recognized from childhood photographs, former colleagues, men whose names had been spoken with reverence at our dinner table. My father saw me and hesitated. It was brief, but I caught it. He didn't wave. He didn't look away either. He simply waited. "Morning," I said when I reached them. "Morning," he replied. His voice was steady, but his eyes searched my face as if he were trying to read a language he'd never learned. One of the men smiled at me. "Good to see you again," he said, then added my last name with a familiarity that surprised my father. "We've heard about you." My father stiffened slightly. I could feel it beside me like a shift in air pressure. Inside the building buzzed with the low hum of conversation. Coffee stations had been set up near the walls. People clustered in small groups, trading updates and pleasantries. It looked like any number of events I'd attended over the years, except now I was seeing it through my father's eyes, and that changed everything. He watched as people greeted me. Not effusively, not with ceremony, just with recognition. A nod here, a brief exchange there. Titles weren't spoken aloud, but they hovered in the air understood. My brother arrived late as usual. He clapped my father on the shoulder and launched into a story about traffic without noticing me at first. When he did, he paused. "Hey," he said. "Didn't know you'd be here again." "I was invited," I replied. He glanced at our father, then back at me. "Right," he said, uncertain. "So, what exactly do you do again?" The question was casual, but it carried years of assumption. I felt my father tense beside me, waiting to hear how I'd answer. "I work," I said simply. My brother laughed, thinking I was joking. My father didn't. The luncheon began shortly after. We took our seats at a round table near the center of the room. Name cards marked places. Mine included my full name, no qualifiers. My father stared at it longer than necessary before sitting down. The speaker was a civilian official, someone tasked with translating military priorities into language that made sense to the outside world. He spoke about responsibility, about trust, about the weight of decisions made quietly and carried alone. His words were measured, almost gentle, the kind of speech designed for people who'd lived long enough to understand what wasn't being said. At one point, he referenced operators who work without recognition, and several heads turned toward me before looking away again. My father noticed. I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands folded together on the table. After the applause faded, people began to stand and mingle. My father remained seated. "Can we talk?" he asked finally. I nodded. We stepped away from the noise into a quieter hallway lined with framed photographs. Ships, squadrons, ceremonies frozen in time. My father stood with his hands behind his back, studying an image as if it might offer guidance. "I didn't know," he said at last. "I know," I replied. He turned toward me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I considered the question carefully. "I did," I said. "Just not in the way you expected." He frowned. "I don't understand." "You listened for what fit," I said gently, "not for what was there." The words hung between us. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see the struggle playing out behind his eyes, the instinct to defend himself, to explain, to justify. He didn't give in to it. That in itself felt like progress. "I thought I knew you," he said quietly. I nodded. "You knew the version of me that made sense to you." We stood there for a moment longer, surrounded by images of certainty and legacy. When we returned to the room, nothing had visibly changed. People still talked, coffee still steamed, but something fundamental had shifted. As we walked out together later that afternoon, my father didn't walk ahead of me. He matched my pace. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was the first time he hadn't assumed I'd follow behind. The days between the luncheon and the next briefing stretched in a way I hadn't expected. Not with tension exactly, but with a strange attentiveness. My father called once just to ask if I'd arrived home safely. He didn't fill the silence with advice or questions. He simply listened when I said yes. That alone told me he was still turning things over in his mind, examining old assumptions like tools he'd trusted for years, and now wasn't sure how to use. The follow-up briefing was scheduled for the end of the week. This one wasn't public-facing, not even in the limited way the first had been. The email came through a secure channel, brief and precise. Time, location, clearance reminder, no room for interpretation. I arrived early, as I always did. The building sat farther from the main areas of the base, a low structure with few windows and an unremarkable exterior. It was designed not to draw attention, which suited its purpose. Inside, the air felt cooler, controlled. The kind of place where every sound seemed intentional. Security protocols were tighter this time. Identification checked twice. A secondary verification that took a few extra seconds longer than usual. The guard handed my badge back with a polite, neutral expression, but his eyes carried recognition. Not familiarity, understanding. Inside the briefing room, the seating was arranged differently. Fewer chairs, wider spacing, a large table dominated the center. This wasn't a room for observers. This was a room for participants. I took my seat and placed my notebook in front of me. As others filtered in, I noticed how the room filled with quiet competence. No idle chatter, no posturing. People nodded to one another, brief acknowledgments that carried years of shared context. This was the part of military life most people never saw, the absence of spectacle. My father arrived just before the doors sealed. He paused when he saw the setup, the reduced seating, the absence of his usual peers. This wasn't his world anymore. He took a chair near the back, posture straight, expression careful. He looked at me once, then away. The commander entered without ceremony. He was a Navy man, but not one who leaned on rank for authority. His presence was steady, his movements economical. When he spoke, the room listened. He began by outlining the situation. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't soften it either. He spoke plainly about risk, about uncertainty, about decisions that would have consequences, no matter how carefully they were made. He explained enough to ground the conversation without exposing more than necessary. Then he said the words again. Not louder this time, not with emphasis, just as a fact. I need someone cleared for black operations. The room went still. I felt the familiar internal check, the brief scan of my own readiness. Training, experience, context, everything aligned. I stood. The sound of my chair against the floor seemed louder than it was. I didn't look around. I didn't need to. My father laughed. It wasn't mocking, it was reflex, a sound born of decades of certainty. "Sit down," he said. "You don't belong here." The commander's gaze shifted to me, not my father. "Call sign," he asked. I met his eyes, Shadow 9. There it was. The moment didn't explode, it settled. Recognition moved through the room like a current finding its path. The commander nodded once, already moving on, already integrating my presence into the task at hand. My father froze. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray shock. He didn't gasp or stumble. He simply stopped as if his body had reached a limit it hadn't known existed. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair. His breathing hitched, then resumed shallowly. I saw it all in my peripheral vision even as I focused forward. The briefing continued. Maps were displayed, timelines discussed, questions asked and answered. When I spoke, it was with the same measured tone I'd used for years. No defensiveness, no edge, just clarity. I could feel my father listening differently now, not as a parent indulging a child's ambition, but as a man confronted with evidence that challenged his internal map of the world. Every word I said rearranged something for him. I didn't soften it for his sake. I didn't sharpen it either. When the session ended, the commander dismissed us with a reminder of discretion. Chairs moved, papers were gathered. The room loosened slightly, though the seriousness remained. My father didn't move right away. He waited until the others had filed out before standing. When he did, his movements were slower than usual, as if he were recalibrating. He caught up to me in the hallway. "Shadow 9, he said quietly, testing the name as if it might disappear if spoken aloud. "Yes," I replied. He swallowed. "How long?" "Long enough," I said. He nodded once, eyes fixed ahead. "I thought I knew everything that mattered," he said. "Turns out I didn't know the most important thing." I didn't respond immediately. Some realizations need space to breathe. We walked together toward the exit. He didn't try to fill the silence. He didn't apologize yet. But the certainty that had once framed every interaction was gone, replaced by something more tentative. More honest. Outside, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the concrete. I paused before heading to my car. "You didn't fail me," I said finally. "You just didn't see me." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "I see you now," he said. I believed him, but I also knew seeing was only the beginning. The recognition didn't end when the doors closed behind us. That was the part most people never understand, that moments like the one in the briefing room don't fade when the room empties. They echo. They follow you into quieter spaces and press against old memories demanding to be re-examined. I felt it as I walked across the lot toward my car. The day was bright, ordinary. A few seagulls wheeled overhead, crying out in the way they always had around bases near the water. Somewhere nearby, an engine turned over. Life went on unbothered by revelations. But inside me and inside my father, something had shifted permanently. He stopped me before I reached my car. "Can we sit for a minute?" he asked. There was a bench near the edge of the lot, facing a stretch of grass trimmed to regulation height. I nodded, and we walked there together. He lowered himself carefully, like a man whose body had suddenly become heavier. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the ground. "I keep replaying it," he said after a long pause. "Every conversation we ever had." I stayed quiet. This wasn't the moment for reassurance. "I thought you were holding back because you were unsure," he continued. "I told myself that if you ever really wanted more, you'd say so, that you'd push." "I did," I said gently, just not loudly. He exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "I taught you to be disciplined, to wait your turn, and then I punished you for it." The words surprised him as much as they did me. He hadn't planned them. They came out raw, unpolished. For a while we sat without speaking. The wind stirred the flags in the distance. The steady rhythm felt grounding. When the commander said your call sign, he said finally I felt something break. Not pride, not fear, something else. What I asked. "My certainty," he said. "I built my life on knowing where things stood, who people were, what I could expect. And in that moment I realized I'd been wrong about you for a very long time." I nodded. That can be hard to sit with. He looked at me, then really looked. "You never corrected me." "No," I agreed. "Why?" I chose my words carefully. because I didn't need your permission to become who I was becoming, and because I was tired of being measured against an idea of me that wasn't real. He absorbed that slowly. I thought silence meant distance. Sometimes it means protection, I said. We talked longer than I expected. Not about operations or rank or anything classified. About choices. About the years I spent learning to trust myself when external validation didn't come. About the cost of carrying responsibility quietly. He listened without interrupting. That alone felt like a new chapter. A few days later he called again. This time he asked if he could visit, not to lecture, not to advise, just to sit down and talk. I said yes. He arrived with no agenda and no assumptions. We sat at my small kitchen table, mugs of coffee between us. He noticed things he'd never noticed before, the order of my space, the way I kept things functional and spare. You live like a ship, he said softly. Everything has a purpose. I smiled. Old habits. At one point he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a program from the luncheon, creased and worn. He'd kept it. I've been thinking about what strength really looks like, he said. I used to think it was volume, presence, commanding a room. And now I think it's consistency, he said. Showing up, doing the work, even when no one's watching. I felt something loosen in my chest at that. He didn't ask for forgiveness outright. He didn't need to. His willingness to question himself was apology enough for now. Before he left, he paused at the door. I can't change the way I saw you then, he said, but I want to earn the right to see you properly now. I believed him, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them without expectation of absolution. Later that evening, alone in my quiet home, I thought about the moment in the briefing room, about the commander's calm acknowledgement, about my father's breath catching, about the weight of being seen at last. Revenge, I realized, had never been my goal. Vindication hadn't come from proving him wrong, but from standing fully in who I was without shrinking or hardening. Shadow 9 wasn't a mask. It was simply the name attached to years of quiet work done with care and purpose. And for the first time, my father knew that too. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, one neither of us named, but both of us felt. My father didn't retreat, and he didn't rush forward either. He moved carefully, as if learning the weight of a door before pushing it open. For a man who had spent most of his life giving orders, that restraint mattered. He called more often, but not to check up on me. He asked about ordinary things, the weather where I lived, whether the tomatoes in my small backyard planter had survived the last cold snap, if I'd found time to rest. These were not the questions of a superior officer or a disappointed parent. They were the questions of someone trying clumsily but sincerely to know another adult. I noticed the difference immediately. It wasn't just in what he asked, but in how he listened. When I spoke, he didn't interrupt to correct or redirect. He let the pauses stretch. He let my words land where they landed. A month after the briefing, he invited me to dinner at his house. Not a family gathering, just the two of us. That more than anything else told me how serious he was. His house looked the same as it always had. Neat, spare. A place where nothing lingered longer than necessary. But the table was set differently. 2 place settings instead of the usual 4 or 5. He'd cooked himself something he rarely did when I was growing up. Simple food, careful portions. We ate quietly at first. The clink of silverware filled the space where conversation used to feel forced. I talked to your brother, he said eventually. I glanced up. How did that go? He exhaled, poorly at first. I smiled faintly. That sounds about right. He didn't understand, my father continued. He thought I was exaggerating, or trying to make a point. He paused. Then I stopped explaining and just told him to listen. I raised an eyebrow. That was new. I told him my father said, choosing his words, that you weren't competing with him. You never were. That the comparison was mine, not yours. The admission landed softly but firmly. He didn't know what to say, my father added. Neither did I for a long time. We finished dinner and moved to the living room. He poured coffee and sat across from me, hands wrapped around the mug as if it anchored him. There's something I need to say, he said. And I don't want to say it wrong. Take your time, I replied. I used to believe that if I pushed hard enough, the right things would rise to the surface, he said. That pressure revealed character. That's how I was trained. That's how I raised you. I nodded. I knew this part of his story well. What I didn't understand, he went on, was that not everyone announces their strength the same way. Some people carry it quietly, and I mistook that quiet for absence. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the echo of years spent being unseen, but it didn't sting the way it once had. It felt acknowledged. "I'm sorry," he said then plainly. "No qualifiers, no defenses." I took a slow breath. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." We talked late into the evening, about his own upbringing, about the expectations he'd inherited and never questioned, about how the world he'd grown up in had taught him to value sons differently than daughters, even when he didn't want to admit it. "This isn't just about you," he said quietly. "It's about the way I learned to see." That I realized was the heart of it. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes. When he spoke about me to others, he didn't lead with surprise or disbelief. He didn't say, "You wouldn't believe what she does." He said, "My daughter serves." And he said it with a steadiness that felt earned. We weren't suddenly close in the way movies portray reconciliation. There were still gaps, still habits to unlearn. But the space between us no longer felt like a void. It felt like room to move. One afternoon, as we walked along a quiet stretch of shoreline near his home, he stopped and looked out at the water. "I spent my life thinking command meant control," he said. "Now I think it means trust." I watched the waves roll in steady and patient. "That's a hard lesson," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "but a necessary one." I realized then that the true turning point hadn't been the briefing room or the call sign or the moment his breath caught in his chest. It had been what came after what he chose to do once the truth was unavoidable. Revenge stories often end with a reckoning. Mine didn't. It ended with responsibility. With a man learning late in life that authority doesn't grant understanding, and that love, if it's going to last, has to make room for who people actually are. By the time spring settled in, the sharpness of those early weeks had softened into something steadier. Not easier exactly, but more honest. My father and I had crossed a threshold, and now we were learning how to stand on the other side without pretending the past hadn't existed. He suggested we meet somewhere neutral, away from his house and away from my routines. We chose a small diner just off the highway, the kind of place that had been there forever. Vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of regulars. Coffee refilled without asking. A bell over the door that rang softly every time someone came in. It felt right for a conversation that had been waiting most of our lives. We slid into a booth near the window. Morning light filtered in, catching dust motes in the air. My father folded his hands on the table, then unfolded them, then wrapped them around his coffee mug. I recognized the gesture immediately. It was the same one he used before difficult briefings back when he still wore the uniform. "I've been thinking about the things I never asked you," he said. I waited. "What you were afraid of," he continued. "What you carried alone. What you needed." I looked at him across the table, at the lines etched deeper now by time and reflection. "I didn't need you to fix anything," I said carefully. "I needed you to believe me when I told you who I was becoming." He nodded slowly. "I thought belief came after proof." "For you, maybe," I said. "For me, belief was the proof." That seemed to land. He stared into his coffee as if it might offer a response. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "My father never believed me," he said. "Not really. He believed in results, not people." I hadn't heard him speak about his own father in years, not with this tone. "I swore I'd be different," he said. "I thought discipline was the same as care. I didn't realize how often I hid behind it." The diner hummed around us, plates clinking, someone laughing softly at the counter, but our table felt suspended in its own stillness. "I want to do better," he said. "Not as your commander, not as your judge, just as your father." I felt a familiar tightness in my throat, but I didn't push it away this time. "Then listen," I said, "even when what you hear doesn't fit your expectations." He met my eyes. "I can do that." Over the next hour, we talked about things we'd never put words to before. About the loneliness of leadership. About how women in uniform learned early to make themselves smaller in rooms that didn't expect them. About how silence could be misread as uncertainty when it was often restraint. "I thought you were holding yourself back," he admitted. "I was holding myself steady," I corrected gently. He smiled at that, not a proud smile, a thoughtful one. When we stood to leave, he hesitated near the door. There's something else, he said. I've been asked to speak at a small veterans gathering next month. Nothing formal, just stories, perspective. I waited. I told them he continued that I'd only do it if I could talk about what I got wrong. That surprised me. What do you mean? I mean, he said, choosing each word that I want to talk about the danger of assuming we know our children simply because we shaped their beginnings, and about the cost of not listening when they speak in ways that don't sound like us. I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet recognition that this wasn't just about us anymore. The day of the gathering, I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Later that evening, he called me. It went well, he said, harder than I expected, but necessary. I'm glad, I replied. He paused. I used your story, he said. Not the details, just the lesson. That's okay, I said, and I meant it. As the months passed, our relationship found its own shape. We didn't erase old habits overnight, but we named them when they surfaced. We learned each other again this time as two adults standing on equal ground. My brother took longer. Change often does. But even there shifts began. He asked fewer questions meant to compare, and more meant to understand. He stopped assuming he knew the shape of my life. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in my father's garage, I found a photo I'd never seen before. It showed me as a teenager standing stiffly in a borrowed uniform at a school event. I remembered the day clearly. I'd been nervous, unsure, proud in a way I hadn't yet learned how to own. I took that, my father said quietly, standing behind me. I didn't know why at the time. Why do you think you did? I asked. He thought for a moment. Because even then, some part of me knew you were walking a different path. I just didn't know how to follow. I handed the photo back to him. You're following now, I said. He nodded. I am. That, I realized, was the real reconciliation. Not the moment of revelation. Not the stunned silence in a briefing room. But the choice to keep walking toward understanding, even when it meant admitting how far you'd been from it. I used to think stories like this ended with a single moment, the room going silent, the breath catching the truth finally spoken aloud. That's how most revenge tales are told, but life, I've learned, is rarely that tidy. The real ending comes later in smaller choices made without witnesses when no one is keeping score. The summer after everything changed, my father and I fell into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. We spoke once or twice a week, sometimes about important things, sometimes about nothing at all. He asked about my work in ways that respected the boundaries I kept. I answered honestly without trimming myself down or dressing things up. We learned each other's pace. One afternoon he invited me to walk with him at a nearby park. It was the same park where he'd taken my brother fishing when we were kids, the same place I'd tagged along quietly, content to sit on the bank with a book. Back then, I'd thought of myself as an observer. Now I understood I'd been learning how to wait. We walked slowly the way people do when they're no longer trying to get anywhere fast. He stopped now and then to catch his breath, waving off my concern with a small smile. You know, he said at one point, I used to think strength looked like certainty, like having the answer before the question was finished. And now I think strength looks like listening, he said, and being willing to be wrong. That might not sound like much to some people, but coming from a man who'd built his life on command and control, it was everything. We sat on a bench beneath a wide oak tree. Children played nearby. A couple my parents' age walked hand in hand along the path, moving in step without speaking. The scene felt deeply American in its quietness, in the way it suggested endurance rather than spectacle. I've been asked again to speak, my father said. Different group this time, retired folks. Some of them remind me of myself. I waited. I want to tell them something, he continued, something I wish I'd learned earlier. What's that? I asked. That our children aren't extensions of us, he said. They're whole people, and if we're not careful, our certainty can become their cage. I looked at him, really looked, and felt a gentle swell of something that wasn't pride or relief. It was recognition, mutual and earned. When he spoke at that gathering, he told me later the room was quiet. Not the stunned kind of quiet from the briefing room months before, but the reflective kind. The kind where people look inward instead of around. I told them, he said, that I almost missed knowing the most important person in my life, not because she hid from me, but because I didn't know how to see her. He didn't mention call signs or clearances or titles. He didn't need to. The lesson was larger than that. As for me, I went back to my work with the same focus I always had. Nothing about my role changed because my father finally understood it. And that was as it should be. My purpose had never depended on his approval. But the easing of that old weight, the constant, unspoken need to be smaller, allowed me to move through the world with a little more grace. People sometimes ask me now if it felt like revenge that moment when the commander asked for my call sign and everything shifted. I tell them no. Revenge suggests anger. What I felt was clarity. The truth is, the most powerful thing I did that day wasn't standing up. It was standing calmly, speaking plainly, letting the truth exist without embellishment or apology. My father and I still don't agree on everything. We never will. But when he introduces me now, he does it simply. This is my daughter. No surprise, no qualifiers, just respect. And I've come to believe that this is the quiet justice so many of us are really looking for. Not humiliation, not triumph, but understanding that arrives late and stays. If you're listening to this and thinking of someone you've misunderstood, someone you've loved without fully knowing, I hope you take a moment to reach out. Ask a different question. Listen a little longer. It's never too late to see someone clearly. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own silences, your own second chances, I invite you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment, reflect on it, or subscribe for more stories like this one. Sometimes the quiet ones stay with us the longest.